Liam never believed in haunted houses until the night he watched a stranger walk into the ocean and never come back. Now trapped in a decaying beach house with no phone signal, no working car, and wet footprints appearing where no one should be, Liam is starting to understand. Some places don't want you to leave, and one little girl who never left is waiting for him to stay. I rented the beach house because I needed to get away. Not just from the city, or the noise, or the endless cycle of work. I needed to get away from people. I was burned out. Everything felt heavy, fake, crowded. When I found the listing for the house online, it looked like the exact kind of isolation I was craving. Rustic, remote, right on the water. The photos showed a weather-beaten structure, paint peeling, driftwood piled along the porch railing, and nothing but ocean behind it. The description called it the Driftwood House, a name that felt poetic at the time. Now, I wonder if it was meant as a warning. I got there just before dusk. The drive had been long and winding, with spotty GPS service and not a single soul in sight for miles. When I pulled up, the road turned from cracked pavement to gravel, and then to sand. The house sat at the very end of a sloping bluff, framed by dunes and tall grass that swayed in the wind. No neighbors, no sounds except the roar of the ocean and the gulls overhead. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Even from the outside, something about the house made me uneasy. The windows were all dark, like the place was holding its breath. I chalked it up to nerves, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with salt and something else, something musty and organic, like wet wood left too long in the sun. The floorboards creaked under my boots. Everything looked exactly like the listing photos, just more neglected. Dust coated every surface, and spiderwebs stretched between ceiling beams like fine thread. But weirdly, the bedroom was pristine. Clean sheets, smooth comforter, a faint trace of lavender in the air. It was like someone had prepared it just for me. Recently, I tried not to overthink it. Maybe the owner came by earlier in the day to freshen up. Maybe a cleaner had only focused on the sleeping area. I dropped my bag, unpacked the essentials, and went out onto the porch with a cup of tea. The sky had turned purple over the ocean, waves rolling in, strong and steady. It was cold for summer, windy, almost biting. I wrapped myself in a blanket and watched the horizon. For a moment it actually felt like what I'd hoped for, peace, solitude. That's when I saw the figure. They were standing right at the edge of the water, maybe 50 feet down the beach. At first I thought it was a surfer or a local walking the shore, but they weren't moving, just standing there, completely still. No motion, no wave, no shifting of weight. It gave me a weird feeling. I stared for a few minutes, trying to make out more detail, but the light was fading fast. All I could tell was that the figure was tall and dark, almost blending into the sea behind them. Then they moved not toward the dunes, but straight into the ocean. They didn't hesitate, didn't run, just calmly stepped into the waves and kept walking until the water was at their waist. I waited for them to stop, waited for them to turn around, but they didn't. They just kept walking deeper and deeper, until they disappeared under the surface. I stayed outside for another 10 minutes, eyes glued to the spot, waiting for them to come back up. They never did. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay in bed, listening to the wind batter the old siding of the house, the window panes groaning slightly under pressure. The ocean seemed louder than it should have been, like the waves were climbing closer, crashing just beneath the floorboards. Every now and then, I'd hear the distinct sound of wood creaking, but not from the house settling. It was too rhythmic, like footsteps, slow, steady, moving from one room to another. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe the wind was rattling something loose. Maybe the house had rats. Maybe I was just overtired, but part of me knew those weren't the right answers. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something on the porch. Not just wind or a branch tapping the railing, but actual footsteps shuffling, deliberate, close. I held my breath and stared at the bedroom door, waiting. Nothing happened. No knock, no creak of the doorknob. After a long time, I must have drifted off out of sheer exhaustion. When I woke, the room was filled with a soft gray light. The stormy clouds hadn't lifted, and everything outside looked washed out and dull. I got dressed and made coffee, trying to shake the unease from the night before. I told myself I was just wound up, a product of stress and too much isolation. I decided to walk the beach to clear my head. The sand was damp, covered in long ribbons of seaweed and broken shells. But not far from the porch, I noticed something that stopped me. Cold footprints, bare ones, human. They led from the waterline up toward the dunes and stopped right at the base of the house. I crouched down and studied them. They were fresh, no windblown sand, no distortion, and they were small, too small for an adult man. I scanned the shoreline, expecting to see someone in the distance, maybe a swimmer or a curious kid who wandered too far. But there was no one. Just a long stretch of beach and the endless gray ocean. I followed the prints to where they disappeared near the porch steps, then circled around the house. Nothing, no sign of anyone. I felt watched, though, not in the general paranoid way. I mean that deep, spine-prickling sense that something is standing just behind you. I turned quickly a few times, but the beach was still empty. Back inside, I I tried to distract myself by exploring the house more. It had 2 floors, but the upper level was closed off with a rope and a hand-painted sign that read private. I didn't question it. Honestly, I didn't want to go up there. I stuck to the downstairs, mostly the living room and kitchen. That's when I noticed the photograph above the fireplace. It was a faded black and white, slightly warped in the frame. It showed the same house, weathered but intact, probably from the 1950s or 60s. A family stood in front of it. A man, a woman, and a girl, maybe 10 years old. The man and woman were smiling, but the girl looked off. Her face was serious, intense. Her eyes were too wide for her small face, and they didn't seem to be looking at the camera, more like through it. I felt chilled staring at her. Curious, I took the frame off the wall and flipped it over. I was hoping to find a date or names, anything to give context. Instead, I saw a word scratched into the wood with something sharp, jagged, uneven. It simply read, "She never left." I stared at the message for a long time, then slowly set the frame back down. The wind outside had picked up again, and somewhere in the back of the house, a door creaked open on its own. That night, sleep felt impossible. Every creak in the house had weight behind it. Every shift in the wind sounded like it was trying to say something. I kept the bedroom lamp on, not even pretending to want darkness anymore. The bed was comfortable enough, the room warm, but I felt exposed, like someone or something was studying me through the walls. At some point after midnight, I felt it again. That heavy presence in the room, not loud or violent, just there, watching. I stayed still, eyes wide open, straining to hear something beyond the soft hum of the wind. For a moment, there was silence, and then, faintly, the sound of a floorboard groaning. Not from my room, just outside it. A second creak followed, slower this time, like someone was shifting their weight deliberately. I stared at the bedroom door, too afraid to get up. It didn't move, but the feeling didn't go away. Eventually, I worked up enough courage to slip out of bed and tiptoe across the floor. I put my ear against the door. Nothing. I reached for the handle with a shaking hand, then stopped. A shadow passed by the gap beneath the door, quick, almost like a child running past. I stepped back. My mouth had gone dry. I didn't open the door. Instead, I waited. I must have sat on the edge of the bed for over an hour, listening, barely breathing. There were no more footsteps. No voices, nothing. But I couldn't shake the image of that shadow sliding across the floor just inches from where I stood. When morning came, I felt more drained than ever. The sunlight didn't help. It was muted again, overcast, and everything in the house looked dull and cold. I made coffee, trying to ground myself in something normal. The warmth of the mug helped a little, but I kept glancing toward the hallway. It felt like the house was holding its breath. I decided I'd had enough. I was going to leave. The unease was no longer a feeling, it was constant now, pulsing in the walls, in the air. I packed my things quickly, double-checked everything, and walked out to the car with purpose. I sat in the driver's seat, turned the key, and heard nothing. Not even the engine trying to turn over, just silence. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like it might offer an explanation. I don't know much about cars, but the battery cables looked fine. No signs of corrosion. The lights and dashboard were completely dead, like the battery had vanished overnight. I went back inside to grab my phone and check for service. Still nothing. 0 bars. I turned it off and back on again, same result. I even climbed onto the porch railing and held it high, waving it toward the sky like an idiot. The signal didn't return. I wandered around the house after that, looking for anything I'd missed, some emergency phone, a landline, a signal booster. I ended up back in the living room, standing in front of the fireplace, staring up at the family photo again. But something was different. The man and woman were gone, erased, just empty space where they had once stood. The girl was still there, alone now, centered in the frame. Her dress looked darker than before, like it had been wet, and her smile was different. It stretched wider, unnatural, as if someone had tugged at the corners of her mouth with invisible hooks. I didn't remember falling asleep on the couch, but when I opened my eyes hours later, the fire was out. The room was freezing, and there were small, wet footprints on the hardwood leading from the front door toward the hallway. I woke with a jolt, the cold cutting through my clothes like ice water. The fireplace had gone completely out, but the air felt damp, like the walls themselves were sweating. I stayed still for a few seconds, trying to gather myself, trying to remember how I even ended up on the couch. I had no memory of lying down. The last thing I recalled was standing in front of the fireplace, staring at the photo. Now, hours had passed, and my limbs felt stiff and numb. The room was dark, but not completely gray. Light seeped in from outside, and that's when I saw them again. The wet footprints. They started at the front door and curved slowly toward the hallway. Smaller than adult prints, but deep and fresh. They hadn't been there earlier. My chest tightened as I stared at them, each print perfect and glossy in the low light, as if whoever left them had just stepped out of the ocean. The door hadn't opened, no windows were broken. There was no explanation that made sense, none that I wanted to entertain. I forced myself to stand and followed the prints with cautious steps. They disappeared at the hallway entrance. The wooden floor looked dry just past the last mark. I stood there for a long time, staring down that hallway like it might come alive. I could feel something behind the bedroom doors. The pressure in the air had changed. It was heavier, like a storm about to break. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being lured deeper into something I didn't understand. I backed away and grabbed my keys again, refusing to believe I was truly trapped. I told myself the car just needed a jump, or maybe I could walk far enough inland to find a signal. I didn't care if it took all day. I grabbed my backpack, threw in essentials, and left the house without looking back. Behind the house, past the tall grass and dune brush, there was a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before. It looked like it had once been used regularly, but had since grown over in places, nearly swallowed by the coastal vegetation. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a road or at least some sign of civilization. The wind howled low through the reeds, almost like a whisper just beneath the surface. I tried not to focus on the sound, tried to concentrate on my footing. I walked for what felt like an hour. The trail twisted through the dunes, and every few minutes I'd catch glimpses of the ocean off to the side. Then something strange happened. I spotted the house again. Not ahead of me, but to my right, maybe 100 feet away. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't looped back. I had gone straight the entire time. But there it was. Same cracked porch, same driftwood railing, same wind-choked flagpole creaking above the roof. I stood there in disbelief, staring at the place like it had somehow followed me. I walked toward it slowly, as if it might vanish if I blinked. But the closer I got, the more real it became. My boot prints from earlier were still there in the sand. Back inside, I slammed the door and leaned against it, heart racing. The house was darker now, even though it was still early in the day. I tried to light the fireplace again, but the matches kept snapping in half. Eventually, I gave up and just sat in the corner of the room, wrapped in a blanket, waiting for the night. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of the bedroom door creaking open upstairs. It hadn't opened all day. I hadn't even gone near it. I stayed frozen, listening. The floor above groaned, then another soft thump like a barefoot step, then another, each one closer to the stairs. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing. The creaks overhead weren't random now, they were measured, like someone pacing slowly across the upstairs floor. Back and forth, each step deliberate. I sat on the living room floor, every muscle tense, staring at the staircase, waiting to see something come down, but nothing did. The footsteps stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so complete it rang in my ears. That was somehow worse. Silence meant waiting. Silence meant something was aware of me. I didn't sleep again. I stayed awake until the morning light finally broke through the windows, weak and pale. I had lost all sense of time. It didn't even feel like a normal morning. The world outside looked faded, like I was watching it through a sheet of dirty glass. The ocean was gray, the sky was gray, and even the sand looked dull and drained of life. I stepped outside with shaking hands, desperate for fresh air, for anything that felt real. The wind was gone. The air was still, too still. I checked the car again, not because I thought it would work, but because I had to. Still nothing, dead as ever. I walked the perimeter of the house, looking for something. I might have missed a generator, an old landline wire, any tool that could break this weird isolation. But all I found was a strange wooden panel in the hallway that looked slightly ajar. It hadn't been opened before. Behind it was a small compartment, barely big enough for a suitcase. Inside were 4 notebooks stacked on top of each other, their covers warped with age and moisture. I sat down on the dusty hallway floor and opened the first one. The pages were filled with entries, handwritten in different styles. Some messy, some neat, but all with the same tone. Confusion, fear, desperation. They described the same things I'd been experiencing: footsteps, shadows, strange noises, the sense of being watched. One entry described a little girl standing at the edge of the dunes every night, always facing the house. Another mentioned the upstairs being off limits, and how anyone who went up never came back down. I flipped through faster, each entry confirming what I already feared. This wasn't just happening to me, it had happened to others. Over and over again. I opened the final notebook, the one on the bottom. It looked newer. Its pages weren't as yellowed or curled. The handwriting in this one looked eerily familiar. I skimmed the first few pages, and my blood ran cold. It was mine, my handwriting, my words. I read a paragraph I didn't remember writing, dated 5 days earlier, describing the night I arrived. The words were exact, down to the detail of the figure on the beach walking into the ocean. I kept flipping pages, faster and faster, and the entries continued past the present day. They described things that hadn't happened yet, or things I didn't remember happening. One page said I tried to burn the house down. Another said I went into the upstairs room and never came out. The last page just said, "She let me write this, but not to escape." My hands were shaking as I set the book down. The house groaned quietly, as if responding. I looked around. Everything felt tighter, more closed in. The windows were darker now, though the sun should have been rising. I backed away from the compartment, heart hammering, and turned to leave. But the hallway had changed. It was longer than before, stretching endlessly, and the light bulbs overhead were dimming one by one. From the far end, I heard small, wet footsteps, slow, measured, getting closer. I ran for the front door, grabbed the handle, and yanked. Didn't move, and then I saw her, standing at the bottom of the staircase, barefoot, drenched, smiling. I never left that house. At least, not in any way that matters.